We're in the 5th chapter of Genesis this morning, where we find death and hope intermingled. On the one hand, this is quite a gloomy passage. It records for us the tragic effects of sin, as one by one, various people born into the world then exit the world. Death has invaded the once unblemished earth God had made and now casts its dismal shadow over everything. We find here 8 obituaries testifying to the fact that man has indeed become mortal. But on the other hand, there are some bright rays glimmering through the gloom. There's one man who escapes death, and another whose name speaks of comfort and relief, of deliverance from the curse that's fallen over the world. Death and hope are interwoven here like 2 threads entwined together in one tapestry. And that reflects how the situation still is in our world today. On the one hand, this monster of death still stalks the earth, sparing no one, but swallowing all of us up in the end, like some kind of beast whose appetite is never satisfied. But on the other hand, hope is held out to us in the gospel, in the good news of Jesus Christ, hope of an escape from death, hope of redemption and deliverance, hope of life everlasting. And consciousness of the first reality is what must drive us to the second. The prospect of the beckoning grave is what should drive us with great urgency to Jesus Christ, who overcame the grave. So what we have here in Genesis 5 is the first ever family tree, an ancient record of the various generations between Adam, the first man, and Noah, his descendant. It's the beginning of a new section in Genesis, as indicated by the phrase, this is the book of the generations of Adam. We've been told all about Adam in the first chapters, and now we're being told what came from him, what arose from him. And on the surface, it may just seem like a rather bland list of long names and numbers, and hardly of great relevance to our lives millennia later. But there are lessons for us to take on board here. Important, weighty, necessary lessons. So we're going to note this morning 3 truths that this ancient genealogy drives home to our hearts. And the first thing the passage shows us is the wages of sin. A gloomy refrain runs right the way through the chapter, hammering home to us the grim results of mankind's rebellion. Back in chapter 2, God had warned the first man, Adam, that if he ate from a certain tree, he would surely die. And in chapter 3, he does take and eat. And now we see the sad consequences of that played out in the family that springs from him. Already one of his sons has died, Abel, killed by his own brother in chapter 4. And now in chapter 5, we see death spreading to everyone. First, the passage reminds us of some basic truths about mankind. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. We read in verse 1, so we're special, elevated above the animal kingdom. We reflect something of the likeness of God himself. Male and female, he created them. Verse 2 continues, establishing again that binary nature of gender, that God designed us to exist in just 2 distinct sexes. And he blessed them and named them man when he created them. So God's benediction rested upon us, his smiling favor. He blessed us. And we were collectively given the name man, Adam in the Hebrew, which means it is perfectly appropriate to refer to the human race as a whole as man or mankind, contrary to political correctness. God did so from the beginning. So here is our identity as human beings, made in God's image, made to be male or female, blessed by God, and all forming one race collectively together. And from verse 3, we're told about various descendants in Adam's line, one being named in each generation. And it's important to recognize that these are literal historical figures, not mere legends or fables. The New Testament treats them as actual individuals of history, our real life ancestors. Luke chapter 3, for example, traces the family tree of Jesus of Nazareth right back to the men mentioned here, like Seth and Adam, those men being regarded as no more mythical than David or Abraham. And the Apostle Paul in Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15 references Adam and makes him foundational to certain important teachings that wouldn't make sense if he were just a literary invention. And then Enoch, mentioned here, is referred to in Jude 14 as the seventh from Adam. And he appears with Noah and Abel in that hall of fame in Hebrews 11, where various Old Testament characters are commended for their faith, which would make no sense if they weren't real, because then their faith would also be imaginary. These early chapters of Genesis are not symbolic myth, but literal history. And in fact, the whole edifice of Christian teaching logically comes crumbling down if you remove this vital historical foundation. These are your actual ancestors you're reading about here, since we all come from Adam, and in fact, we all come from Noah. We're all from one man, or more literally, of one blood. Acts 17:26 tells us we're all, albeit in most cases distantly, related. We're delving into our own family history when we look down this list of names preserved for us from centuries long gone. And as we glance down the chapter, there are lots of different names, lots of different ages, and lots of different children are said to be born. But there's one striking common detail we cannot pass over. The record of each person's life here, bar one, ends with the same dismal words. Look at the end of verse 5. And he died. And the end of verse 8. And he died. The end of verse 11. And he died. And again in verse 14, verse 17, 20, 27 and 31. And he died. And he died. And he died. It's the same inevitable conclusion to each snapshot biography. It doesn't matter how long each man lives. It doesn't matter how many sons and daughters he ends up with. It doesn't matter what name he might be given. It keeps on ending the same way again and again. He died. He died. He died. Like the morbid toll of a repeated death knell, the same funereal note keeps ringing out from this sacred page of Scripture. It's the history of lives that were all cut short, a grim record of death, a family tree where each branch, though it gives rise to others, eventually withers away itself. We're being shown here the effects of sin upon God's good, well-ordered world. This is not how things are meant to be, but it's happening because of what took place in chapter 3. This present chapter is a fulfillment of God's words there in chapter 3, verse 19. Dust you are, and to dust you shall return. Humans weren't designed to be mortal. We were meant to live forever in harmony with God, in unbroken joy and peace and delight. It's only because we've rebelled against that God that our lives are now cut short. It's the consequence of sin. Romans 5 and verse 12 in the New Testament tells us sin came into the world through one man and death through sin. And the end of the next chapter in Romans tells us the wages of sin is death. It's what we earn from disobeying God. It's the payment that's dealt out to us for breaking the Maker's commandments. Adam and Seth and Enosh and Kenan and the others died because of that original rebellion there in the Garden of Eden. We all now inherit Adam's corruption and share in his guilt. And sooner or later, the gift of life gets withdrawn from us. Now, in the case of these ancient men, their lifespans were very long. We find it hard to process the sheer amount of time that they continued on the earth. 930 years for Adam, 912 for Seth, 969 for Methuselah. So if Methuselah had been born in the year of the Battle of Hastings in 1066, he'd still be alive today in the current year with 12 years still left on the clock. These were enormous lifespans compared to our own. And the reason is simply that aging and degeneration would have happened much more slowly back at the beginning, with the effects of the fall increasing bit by bit over time, so that lifespans gradually diminished over the centuries. You already see that happening within the book of Genesis itself. Here in chapter 5, most of those named lived to over 900. Then after the floods, Noah's son Shem only makes it to a mere 600. And Terah, the father of Abraham, died at age 205, a mere spring chicken it must have seemed back in those days, according to chapter 11. And by the time you get to Joseph in the very last verse of this book, he's just 110 when he leaves this world. There was this gradual deterioration in life and health and vitality over time. But even here in the ancient worlds, it's interesting to note that none of them quite managed to make it to 1,000. And Methuselah gets closest, missing it by just 31 years. But it's as though God doesn't want any of them to pass that monumental milestone. They all come short of a clear round 1,000, as though the point being made is, yes, they did live for ages, but death still took them in the end. They weren't allowed to go on and on forever. Their bodies all returned to the dust eventually, and so it has been throughout the ages. Doesn't matter how many years you manage to rack up, in the end, it doesn't matter who you are or where you come from, sooner or later, God calls time on you. And in the words of Ecclesiastes 12, the dust returns to the earth and the spirit returns to God who gave it. None of us can cheat the grave. And it's all because of what happened in the garden. Romans 5:12 continues by saying that death spread to all men because all sinned. That is, we all sinned in Adam, and that's why death took place even before Moses and the formal giving of God's law. Have you ever thought about that before? There weren't any published commandments for people to keep before Moses and Mount Sinai, and yet people still died. Why? Because Adam was our representative, the head and father of the whole human race, acting on behalf of the rest of us, so when he fell, we all fell with him. That's why death is so universal, even in the case of those who haven't actually committed any personal offences. like babies, for example. We mustn't think of each individual's death as being a direct punishment for some particular sin they themselves have committed. We can't say, for example, that someone killed in an accident is being punished for some specific transgression they must be guilty of. It's more general than that. Mankind as a whole has fallen, and mankind as a whole has been sentenced to mortality. It's in Adam that we all die, 1 Corinthians 15:22 tells us, because of our union with him. And if we think that's unfair, it's worth noting that when it comes to the judgment we face after death, it will be our own personal, individual conduct that determines the punishment we face. The Bible consistently talks of our future judgments being according to our works, to what we've actually done. You see that, for example, in Romans 2 verse 6, 2 Corinthians 5 verse 10, and Revelation 20 verse 12. So no one is going to be in hell purely because of Adam's sin. Everyone there will be paying for their own personal, individual sins. And it will be to different degrees as well. Worse in some cases than in others, depending on the severity of the offence. Jesus did speak of some sins being greater than others. In John 19 verse 11, he spoke of the day of judgment being more bearable for some than others. In Matthew 10:15, and of some receiving more blows than others. In Luke 12:47 to 48, sin is not all equally bad. God administers different degrees of punishment based on the severity of the offence. And so physical death comes to all of us, including Christians, because of Adam, but actual punishments beyond this life are dealt out in accordance with how we ourselves have lived as individuals. So we might feel the effects of temporal, earthly judgments here and now because of other people's sin, but eternal judgments will be dealt out entirely in proportion to our own personal conduct. And so for those who belong to Christ, though physical death still happens, it isn't an entirely negative thing, since it transports us into the presence of God and releases us from all troubles. Death is but a doorway into paradise, and most Christians have been persuaded through history that this applies to infants too. It's true that even babies and little ones have original sin. They have a corrupted nature inherited from Adam. That's why you don't have to teach children to do wrong, it just happens. But since judgment is according to actual works, most assume that those without moral understanding are spared hell, the blood of Christ being applied to them to put them right in God's sight. But the point still stands that all human beings now die as a result of what happened in Eden. Death reigns because of Adam's sin. And after death, Hebrews 9:27 tells us, comes that judgment, when how we have lived will come under the righteous scrutiny of our Maker. The vital question this raises is, are you ready for death? Is it something you have properly grappled with? Unless Jesus Christ returns first, your biography is going to end the same way as Adam's and Seth's and Methuselah's. And then, after all you may have achieved in life, he dies or she dies. It's something we all need to think very seriously about. You are not going to be here forever. There is a definite endpoint coming your way. And a wise person comes to terms with that and prepares for what's next. We need to get right with God now so that we'll be able to face him then. So that when your time comes, death will be a gateway into glory and not a trapdoor down into hell. And how can we be ready? Through faith. Through trusting in someone else who died, but whose story then continues. The only person who used to be dead, but isn't any longer. The one who says, I am he who lives and was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore. Namely, Jesus Christ, our risen Lord. He is the answer. Through his own death, he paid for all the sins we've committed so that they could be forgiven. He turned God's judgment away from us, and through his resurrection, he guarantees that all who trust in him will themselves rise back up out of their tombs for everlasting glory. This passage is here to tell you what sin produced: death for each and every one of us. But the rest of the Bible unveils a death conqueror, that seed of the woman promised in chapter 3, Jesus, our victorious Lord. Then the second thing this passage shows us more briefly, in verses 21 to 24, is the walk of faith. There's one glorious exception to the pattern of death that dominates the rest of the chapter. Jared, we're told, fathered Enoch, who in turn fathered Methuselah at 65 years of age. And Enoch, verse 22, tells us, walked with God after he fathered Methuselah for 300 years. And what happened at the end of those 300 years? Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. It's a much younger age than the final total of all the others in this list, 365. But the way he left this world is phrased differently from all the other cases. Not, and he died, but God took him. And Hebrews 11 verse 5 explains what this means. By faith Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death. And he was not found because God had taken him. So he was translated bodily into heaven without passing through physical death. In death, a person's spirit is separated from their body, but in this instance, there was no separation and no return of Enoch's body to the dust, but he was taken body and all directly into the presence of his Maker above. It's one of only 2 instances where this happens in the Bible, the other being Elijah, who in 2 Kings 2 is taken bodily into heaven by a whirlwind. Enoch avoided death altogether. From the human perspective, he just vanished. People, no doubt, would have been out looking for him. Methuselah and his other children would have searched far and wide for any sign of what had happened to him, but no body could ever be found because he'd been whisked straight off into paradise. And what was it about this man that gave rise to such an extraordinary departure from the earth? Well, twice here the text tells us he walked with God. And the ancient Greek version of the Old Testament renders it, he pleased God. And so when you come to Hebrews 11, we read that before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. So here was a man who lived in such a way that God took special delight in him. God's pleasure beamed down upon this man as he journeyed through a fallen world. He walked with God. It's an expression also used later of Noah. In chapter 6, verse 9, Noah walked with God. What does it mean? It means to live your life in fellowship with God, in consciousness of his presence, in harmony with his will, in obedience to his commands. Enoch didn't live his life independently. doing his own thing, carving out his own course. He walked through this world in dependence on God, in communion with God, in friendship with God. I think of two people taking a literal walk together out in the countryside. They're going along side by side with each other, keeping in step with one another, and almost certainly, hopefully, engaging with each other along the way, not blanking each other, but talking and conversing and sharing the experience. And perhaps if they're a couple or a family, they'll be holding hands as they go along. There's this close connection between people walking together. When you walk with someone, you acknowledge them, you interact with them, you participate in conversation. And that appears to be the picture being set before us here. Enoch and the living God of heaven walked along as friends. Although Enoch couldn't see God, he lived in the consciousness that he was there and engaged with him. He spoke with him. He trusted him. He had this meaningful personal relationship with him, as though his little human hand was being held at all times in the grasp of the Almighty. He walked with God. And so when Enoch left this world, as someone has expressed it, he changed location, but not company. He was in a different realm, but his fellowship with God just continued, albeit heightened and deepened by that transfer from earth into heaven. Enoch had pleased God on earth. God's favor and delight rested upon him like the bright beams of summer sunshine. And then God took him to be with him in heavenly splendor, into that place where his glory and majesty are fully unveiled for his servants to bask in. He pleased God, and he went to be with God, escaping death. And though this is an exceptional incident, there is a lesson for us here. There is a way to escape the curse of death. There is a way to live with God forever. There is a way to be received into God's presence, even though sin has banished us. So how do we please God? How can we come under his favor and approval? Well, Hebrews 11 tells us it's through faith. That's what Enoch had, by faith. Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death. And the next verse then tells us that without such faith, it's impossible to please God, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he is and that he rewards those who seek him. That's what Enoch had. That was his secret, if you like. He was convinced God was there, that he was who he says he is, good and great and glorious and the rewarder of his people. And so he diligently sought him. He drew near to God. He called on his name. He lived in humble, trusting dependence upon him. And that's what you and I must do. We're to be those who take God at his word, believe wholeheartedly that he's there, and that he's the one who can give us our true heart's desire, the ultimate treasure that there is, the one worth knowing above all else, more satisfying than anything else. And so we lead a life that's founded on faith. A life built on the realization there's a good God in heaven. And so we walk with him through life, spiritually speaking, trusting him, loving him, knowing him, fearing him. Can that be said of you? That God isn't just a concept in your mind, a theory in your head, a doctrine in your creed, but someone you've come to engage with personally, someone you've entered into an actual relationship with, someone you're actively depending and relying upon day by day. You cannot please God without such faith. It is impossible. But when we do place our confidence in this unseen God, when we embrace him as our own God and accept his son Jesus as Lord, relying on him for that salvation we need, then and only then we begin to please God. His delight rests on us, and from that faith springs a whole different way of living a life where God matters, a life where we're not just concerned about doing our own thing, but honouring God, following his ways, and heeding his commands. And what's the result of thus walking with God? What can we expect if we've come to settle our life's confidence in the Lord? Well, we too will escape death and live forever. Not in exactly the same way as Enoch. Unless Christ comes back first, our bodies will fail and go down into the grave. But Jesus takes the sting out of death. There's no penal judgment waiting for those who believe in him. No condemnation looming over us now. No fearful prospect of having to pay up for any of our transgressions of God's law. It's all been paid for by Jesus. And ultimately, he promises to reverse physical death itself, to bring back our very bodies up out of the grave and make them glorious and immortal. He is the resurrection and the life, the one who conquered the grave himself, and we are going to share in his victory if we simply lodge our faith in him. There's a way to triumph over death, like Enoch of old, and it's the way of faith, committing your life and your future into God's capable hands and resting in the promise of one greater than Enoch, who, though he did die, rose again and then was taken up bodily himself into heaven. And from there, he'll one day return. Enoch himself prophesied of the second coming, according to Jude verse 11, saying, "Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000 of his holy ones." And when he does, that's when he'll summon the dead out of their tombs and transform our lowly bodies so that they're like unto his glorious body, and will live and reign with him forever. There's one final detail to note as we close. That's the word of hope, found in verses 28 to 29. Now, some have claimed that there is actually a secret prophecy coded into the names of this chapter. Put them all together, it said, and you get the following message. Man is appointed to mortal sorrow, but the blessed God shall come down, teaching that his death shall bring the despairing comfort. Sounds great. But the trouble is, the exact meaning of several of the names here is unclear and disputed, and you only get that kind of coherent sentence if you use modern English word order and if you tweak some of the nouns into verbs and add some extra connecting words of your own. The names don't really form a proper sentence in the original Hebrew, and so seeing hidden messages like this is really rather fanciful. But we don't need a coded prophecy anyway, because there's a straightforward one in verse 29. Lamech, Enoch's grandson, names his son Noah, saying, "Out of, or because of, the ground the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands." It's a promise of rest or comfort coming, deliverance from that curse which God had placed upon the earth. And though Noah was involved in a kind of deliverance, the building of the ark, by which he rescued his family when the floods came, yet ultimately it's in Noah's seed, his offspring, that the full and final relief would come. Old Testament prophecies often speak this way. For example, in Genesis 12:3, God says to Abraham, "In you all the nations of the earth will be blessed." Well, it wouldn't be through Abraham as an individual that would happen, but through his line, through someone who'd come from him, namely Jesus. And similarly here, it wouldn't ultimately be through Noah as an individual that redemption from the curse would come, but through his line, through one of his descendants. Lamech did have other sons and daughters, verse 30 tells us, but it was Noah who was the special one, because it would be through him, through his family, that the Messiah would come, that seed of the woman already promised back in chapter 3, verse 15. And in that sense, through Noah, salvation would come to the earth. relief from the cursed state into which our world has fallen, because Jesus Christ would be born of Noah's line, and at his first coming he'd deal with all the sin that's given rise to God's curse in the first place, bearing the full punishment for that sin himself upon the cross, and then at his second coming he'll lift away the actual curse from the physical earth, renewing creation back into an unblemished condition, bringing eternal rest to all who put their trust in him. We need relief from the trouble and toil, pain and distress that are part and parcel of life in a fallen world, and it's the seed of Noah, Jesus Christ, who brings that relief. Certain hope of death reversed, the curse removed, and paradise restored for all who call upon his name. Amen.